Established in 2007, Middle East Studies at Marine Corps University brings in guest lecturers to speak about topics of importance to the United States Marine Corps and wider Department of Defense and U.S. government communities concerning the Middle East, broadly defined. In line with Middle East Studies' mission, the MES lecture series and other MES talks and panels provide up-to-date information and analysis on the broader Middle East, including South and Central Asia, North and Sub-Saharan Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Black Sea and Red Sea regions.
Welcome to everyone. It's our pleasure on behalf of Middle East Studies and the Krulak Center to welcome Dr. Said Muhammad Ali to talk to us about strategic competition and possible avenues for cooperation on mutual interests between the US and China in Pakistan and South Asia. Dr. Ali is an anthropologist by training, and he teaches multiple courses on research methodologies on human and international security in South Asia at Johns Hopkins, American University, Georgetown, and he's previously taught at George Washington and George Mason universities as well. And he has a book in 2015 published by Routledge, Development, Poverty, and Power in Pakistan, the Impact of State and Donor Interventions on Farmers. And we welcome him to Marine Corps University. Dr. Ali.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, everyone else, for taking the time to join in on this talk. The aim of my talk today is to try and take a human-centric view of great power competition in the hopes of identifying some mutually beneficial areas of collaboration between China and the US, specifically within the South Asia region. So the implications of great power competition are becoming increasingly apparent across South Asia, which is home to nearly a quarter of the world's population. Both China and the US continue wooing smaller states in the region, including Sri Lanka and Nepal, and even more populous states like Bangladesh. However, the contestation between these two great powers is most evident and consequential for India and Pakistan, the two largest nations in South Asia, which remain locked in an ongoing rivalry. The varied implications of growing Sino-American rivalry in South Asia are best contextualized by taking a longer view of American and Chinese relations with both these nuclearized states. Now, the United States has long-standing ties with both Pakistan and India, going back to the creation of these two nation states in 1947 from the British colonial bifurcation of the Indian subcontinent. Pakistan, after its creation, soon thereafter joined American Cold War alliances like the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization and the Central Treaty Organization in the late 1950s. India, on the other hand, decided to pursue more of a non-aligned policy. However, the US continued to engage with India as well during the Cold War era, which might have helped avert a gradual Indian tilt towards the Soviet camp. Despite its more explicit alliances with Pakistan, the US also tried to avert recurrent conflicts between India and Pakistan. The US placed sanctions on both these states after the 1965 war, and then after the 1971 war, which led to the breakaway of the eastern wing of Pakistan and the creation of modern-day Bangladesh. The US significantly ramped up aid to Pakistan during the 1980s, though, when Pakistan worked with the US to train and arm Mujahideen groups to repel the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan between the invasion was between 1979 and 1989, but the cooperation between Pakistan and the US kind of took off a few years thereafter. However, less than a decade after sort of the Soviet exit from Afghanistan, the US briefly imposed sanctions again on India and Pakistan because of their nuclear tests in 1998, when they both became declared nuclear powers. Now, given perhaps the futility of its attempt to help the two regional rivals resolve their most serious and lingering dispute over the contested territory of Kashmir, the US government under the Clinton administration decided to dehyphenate its relationship with India and Pakistan. The US increasingly began to see India, the largest democracy in the world, as a natural ally with whom it could create a new strategic relationship which was needed to curb growing Chinese influence in this broader region. American support to Pakistan also spiked again now during the American-led post 9/11 intervention in Afghanistan. Yet, despite being a frontline state in the global war on terror, Pakistan's relationship with the US remained strained due to a variety of divergent interests. Pakistan, on the one hand, felt underappreciated for the human and economic toll that the country had to bear due to its decision to support America in Afghanistan, whereas American assessments indicated that Pakistan was not doing enough to defeat the Afghan Taliban. Pakistan did play a vital role in nudging the Taliban to negotiate peace with the US in 2020, but it was less successful in brokering inter-Afghan talks. Pakistan has subsequently been trying to advocate for the need for Taliban recognition. After the regime the Taliban regime took over Afghanistan quite suddenly after the exit of NATO forces in mid-2021. However, it is important to note here that Pakistan's own relations with the Taliban are also quite strained due to, in part, the reluctance of the Taliban to clamp down on cross-border terrorist outfits, especially the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, and also due to lingering contentions over the colonial era Durand line, which separates the two countries, which the Taliban, like the former Afghan government, do not want to recognize as an international border. On the other hand, Sino-Pakistani relations have remained much less turbulent. The two countries initially forged military and diplomatic ties after China and India had a brief war back in 1962 over a territorial dispute within the Himalayas. Subsequent Chinese support remained instrumental in shielding Pakistan from international censure due to alleged use of militant groups to support the insurgency in Indian-held Kashmir, and Chinese support also proved instrumental in helping Pakistan maintain some semblance of conventional and then later nuclear parity with a much larger rival state. Now, in recent years, we have seen China and Pakistan being able to build on this security relationship to create a much more robust geo-economic alliance, with Pakistan becoming the flagship site for the ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. India, on the other hand, has joined the US-led Quad, which also includes Australia and Japan, and it has increased cooperation with the US on security and economic issues. So we see over this past decade or so an increased sort of, on the one hand, collaboration between China and Pakistan, and on the other hand, a collaboration between India and the US. And yet, like the US-China relationship, the relationship between China and India also, despite tensions and even recent border skirmishes again in the Himalayas in 2020 and 2021, India and China still have a very robust trade relationship, yet there is, now there is increasing competition between them. India perhaps fears now the possibility of a two-front war, which might involve Pakistan and China, sort of launching, attacks on India from both sides, And on the other hand, China is increasingly wary of India's growing alliance with the US, and its ambitions to check Chinese influence in South Asia with American support, because that's the only way that India can offer some credible competition to China at the moment. Scholars have in fact alluded to a strategic chain linking Pakistani insecurities to growing Indian military ambitions, whereby India in turn is trying to respond to Chinese military capabilities as China itself tries to achieve deterrence with the United States. This strategic interdependence is fueling an arms race and is feared to create further destabilization in an already extremely tense region. Now, besides exploring a range of conventional confidence building measures to enable strategic stability, to enable sort of conflict mediation and conflict resolution in times of crisis, it is also important for the US, which serves as the highest link within this strategic chain, to simultaneously explore alternative measures to further its national interests. And it is here where Pakistan can potentially play a useful role. Now, while Pakistan's implementation of the China-Pakistan economic corridor has encountered varied stumbling blocks, both countries keep reiterating their desire to continue working on this project and further expanding its scope of operations and linking it to adjoining countries, including Afghanistan. However, much has not occurred on that front yet. But of course, it is part of that bigger BRI initiative. And Pakistan, on the other hand, has had turbulent relations with the US, as I alluded to earlier, and it's already stressed relations with the US saw another dip when the country's former Prime Minister Imran Khan categorically refused to provide the US over-the-horizon capabilities to continue targeting global jihadi networks in Afghanistan. This was, of course, before the hit on al-Zawahiri. And also there has been a lot of sort of, stress over Pakistan's seeming closeness to the senior Taliban leadership, which displaced the US-backed Pakistan government. Pakistan, on the other hand, has been saying that it has no choice, given its proximity to Afghanistan, to deal with whoever is in power. So there has been sort of, the trade-off of lingering accusations, and then adding on to this kind of already tense the stress in the bilateral relationship, there were accusations by Pakistan's Prime Minister Khan, former Prime Minister now, of an American conspiracy to topple his government due to his insistence on maintaining an independent foreign policy, and that has created, I mean, it touched a nerve, and sort of growing anti-American sentiment within the country for a variety of reasons, which we can perhaps get into afterwards in our conversations. But now there is a new coalition government which is, in power in Pakistan, and this government, as well as the powerful military establishment, seem keen to rebuild ties with the US in order to strike a balance in Pakistan's bilateral relations with China and the US, perhaps in order to lessen Pakistan's dependence on either of the two great powers. The US also recognizes the need for continued engagement with Pakistan, not only in the effort to contain jihadi influences in Afghanistan, but for broader regional stabilization, and also in part to stem Pakistan's sort of entirely going over and becoming completely dependent on China. Now, the current American US administration, the Biden administration, does need a broader spectrum of options in terms of contending with China, rather than, especially in South Asia, and that, that requirement needs to go beyond merely trying to bolster India's capacity to act as a bulwark against Chinese influence in South and Southeast Asia. Senior officials in the Biden administration, including the Secretary of State, have articulated the need for a multi-pronged approach to China, which is flexible enough to be competitive when it should be, collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must be. Yet China's growing reliance on Russia due to shared strategic goals in the Middle East and now amidst the Russian invasion of Ukraine have made it difficult for the US to find ways in which it can operationalize a full spectrum approach to contend with Chinese influence. The 2022 National Defense Strategy notes that China remains the most significant strategic competitor for the US in the foreseeable future. And the strategy lays out varied means to contend with this challenge. Yet, there is still a dearth of options, feasible options of trying to test more collaborative approaches which can serve both Chinese and American interests. While it may not be practical for Pakistan to facilitate another Nixonian détente between China and the US, Pakistan is still well placed to provide America a neutral enough space to compete and possibly collaborate with China. To do so, however, America will also need to broaden the scope of its still largely security-dominated and transactional relationship with Pakistan. It's also important to identify feasible pathways for mutually beneficial cooperation and collaboration, which can also serve to lessen Pakistan's dependence on China while offering Pakistan, China, and America mutually beneficial opportunities for cooperation and collaboration. So the US, to me, seems like the US needs to kind of, go beyond. In order to do this, the US needs to go beyond focusing on traditional security imperatives and embrace a broader human-centric notion of security in order to compete and cooperate with China, specifically within the South Asian context. The US had been trying to sort of think of other ways, right? And it had put its weight behind the G7's announcement of the Build Back Better World initiative, last year, which had aimed to leverage the private sector to generate something like $40 trillion globally to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative in offering sort of better quality international infrastructure, which would also promote human development. Now, this initiative has yet to take off, really, so it's not yet clear whether countries like Pakistan will be able to participate in it alongside its existing economic collaboration with China, and hence be able to link the CPEC and possibly, provide a pilot for an integration between BRI and the Build Back Better World initiative, or will that be impossible and it's going to be an either-or situation? So it's too early to say, how this will play out, how this initiative will play out, particularly in countries which are already participating in BRI. So that's one issue where there's been an attempt for economic collaboration, but still too early to say. China and the US had also decided to adopt a more collaborative approach to contend with climate change. And they decided to do so at the Global Climate Summit in 2014. But actual evidence of bilateral cooperation is still scant. There has been the US-China Climate Working Group, but that group was suspended on the heels of the House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan earlier this year. However, the meeting between President Xi and President Biden on the sidelines of the G20 moot in Indonesia and Bali earlier this month seems to have enabled the resumption of formal talks on climate change, which could also offer another opportunity, another window of opportunity to explore how this kind of collaboration can, take place. And climate is a common threat to both these great powers as well as to the rest of the world. So besides trying to curb their own emissions, being the largest emitters, the US and China can also work together to help poorer countries facing the brunt of climate threats, especially a country like Pakistan, which has experienced massive floods and the loss and damage, the recognition of the need for loss and damage reparations to poorer countries at the latest COP that both great powers have sort of acknowledged, while the funding mechanisms for it have not been sorted. It provides them an opportunity because both these countries still maintain fairly strong ties with Pakistan to try and test how that remunerating Pakistan for loss and damage, how they can work together to build resilience against impending climate threats. To do all of this, though, the US will need to transcend a zero-sum approach of contending with Chinese influence in Pakistan. And it needs to do so because the US itself does not have the will or the need even to outmatch Chinese investments in Pakistan. I mean, it's not practical for the US to outbid China and invest $70 billion in Pakistan, given its contending interests around the world. However, on the other hand, kind of didactic attempts to caution Pakistan against Chinese predatory lending are not going to work either, and they have been dismissed in the past by both Chinese and Pakistani authorities. And while Pakistan has seen a lot of, it's increasingly dependent on Chinese foreign direct investment. It's happening in a context where foreign direct investment was not coming from elsewhere, right? So there is still there's ample opportunity within Pakistan for American private sector, American foreign direct investment to in fact piggyback on opportunities that have been created by Chinese infrastructure projects, where there are all these tax breaks that that can help the American private sector sort of do business, and in that process enable Pakistan to diversify, the loans that it has to pay back to China now there needs to be economic activity within the country. Unless there's diverse foreign direct investment, Pakistan is going to become increasingly dependent on China, right? So that debt diplomacy and predatory lending could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that can be averted if there is American economic interest, mutually beneficial economic interest, which also signals other sort of investors to to go into Pakistan. And of course there are still existing challenges like an increasingly precarious security situation, etc., that have to be kept in mind. But those opportunities do still exist, especially in protected areas like the special economic zones, which I'll speak about a bit more. So let me sort of circle back to the idea of climate change. The Pentagon, its quadrennial defense review back in 2014 had warned about the threat multiplying impacts of climate change, which could be particularly acute in populous regions like South Asia, where rival states increasingly share stressed water resources like the Indus River. The US can try to negotiate a revision of the World Bank brokered Indus Water Treaty of 1960, which still provides the basis of water sharing between India and Pakistan. While this treaty was able to survive several conflicts between the two hostile neighboring states, this treaty did not really envision the threat of ongoing glacial melt. And this ongoing glacial melt really necessitates, which is stressing the existing water sources, because the Indus River is primarily fed by the Himalayan glaciers. It really now there's need for a much more comprehensive and a cooperative approach to water sharing than was envisioned in the Indus Water Treaty framework, which primarily bifurcates the rivers of the Indus and gives a certain smaller proportion to India, and the rest of them come into Pakistan. But now there's need to think of the Indus Basin in a much more holistic manner, to share more data. And the US, given its independent bilateral ties with both India and Pakistan, and the influence it enjoys with the World Bank, is quite well placed to try and help climate-proof the Indus Water Treaty, to avert future water disputes from becoming another very serious source of friction between India and Pakistan. And in fact, such efforts would also provide interesting insights and valuable lessons for China and India to, cooperate further, more effectively on shared waterways like the Brahmaputra and waters emerging from the Indus Basin. Now, coming back to the idea of the special economic zones that have been created under the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the American private sector has not only doing conventional business, in be it IT or manufacturing, etc., but it has a particular niche of trying to help green CPEC, right? And there's been a recognition. China has also said that it's not going to invest in further coal projects, but a lot of the energy portfolio of CPEC projects in Pakistan are coal-fired plants, right? So, and solar is still like a growing sector for Pakistan. So there could be a range of options for the American private sector, to offer technological solutions to help green Pakistan's energy portfolio, to help climate-proof its infrastructure, which repeatedly sees damage when there are these devastating floods. American investments, in fact, carefully planned and perhaps in working in collaboration with entities like USAID, there's possibilities of trying to turn, in fact, these special economic zones into viable hubs for internally displaced climate migrants who otherwise end up in already overcrowded slums in megacities like Lahore and Karachi. And there's precedent now of Bangladesh, for instance, which is trying to do this. It's trying to manage internal displacement rather than it haphazardly overflowing into Dhaka and other crowded parts of the country. It's trying to create economically viable areas for those economic migrants to go where they have the possibility of jobs. So managing this idea, and these special economic zones which have been created under CPEC actually need that kind of human resource. So well-trained human resource. So it's not all business is not making all the money here, but it's also it's trying to provide relief to ordinary citizens as well and creates opportunities for them. So there's lots of potential there. Now, turning to Afghanistan, the US can support efforts to increase economic cooperation between marginalized Pakistani and Afghan citizens, which can bypass the need to work directly with the Taliban regime. American legislators have long been trying to enact a reconstruction opportunity zone straddling the Afghan-Pakistan border, whereby jointly produced goods like leathers and textiles could be provided duty-free access to American markets. However, domestic opposition within the US did not enable this legislative effort to succeed. However, another bill aiming to reinvigorate the ROZ idea was reintroduced with bipartisan support after the American pullout from Afghanistan. Yet this effort too seems to have lost traction. However, the need to identify means to create economic opportunities for ordinary Afghans remains imperative given the ground realities in the country. So exploring more targeted possibilities to source perhaps niche artisanal products made by Afghan women or Afghan refugees in Pakistan in collaboration with Pakistani NGOs, which have a lot of experience with such initiatives, would certainly not encounter much domestic opposition within the US as a broader ROZ type arrangement did. But I mean, these efforts would be of much more limited scale, much more modest. To try and achieve broader sort of impact, the US can support Pakistan to operationalize those nascent border markets with Afghanistan by trying to improve the transport and logistical capabilities, by putting in place effective border management tools, to facilitate trade without undermining security concerns. Supporting these border markets adjoining Afghanistan can also allow the US to invest in the long neglected development of Balochistan and tribal areas of Pakistan, where the benefits of top-down CPEC investments have not sufficiently percolated to the locals. The US Department of Defense can also explore possibilities, and some of this might already be happening, for partnering with Pakistan and perhaps also with China to contend with the growing threat of Islamic State Khorasan, which is a group that all regional states, including India, Iran even, China, and the Taliban themselves view as a dangerous threat. Such counterterrorism cooperation would not only serve American interests of dismantling jihadi networks with global ambitions, but it would also provide a sense of relief to the religious and ethnic minorities in Afghanistan, which are currently facing the brunt of ISK attacks. Now, the US cannot primarily rely, in my opinion, on India's ability to simultaneously engage in an adversarial competition with China and be able to wean smaller South Asian states away from Chinese influence. India has no doubt acquired significant influence in recent years, but it is not yet capable of effectively countering China. Bolstering India's military capabilities also triggers Pakistani insecurities, which in turn lead Pakistan to increasingly depend on Chinese support to maintain a strategic deterrence against India. Moreover, India's own democratic credentials are currently under stress due to the ethno-majoritarian rule of the Modi government, which increasingly makes it a problematic partner for neighboring states with sizable, neighboring South Asian and Southeast Asian states with sizable Muslim populations. The US thus needs to invest in alternative strategies to contend with the growing Chinese footprint in South Asia. Pakistan is the only regional country with the potential to not only maintain a balanced relationship with both China and the US, but to also offer some potential opportunities for the US and China to work together to promote human-centric security goals that are in the national interest of both the global powers and which can also have a positive impact on much needed regional stabilization in South Asia.
So given the very tense and sort of fragile political situation in Pakistan right now domestically, with the former prime minister, perhaps soon to be, sooner rather than later, prime minister again, Imran Khan, is recovering from being shot, of course. If he's elected and becomes prime minister again, what do you see as sort of how would that affect some of your policy suggestions from the Pakistani side, from the US side, and also from the Chinese side? How will his policies potentially, his government's policies, be different from the current government's policies? Would it be similar to his approach when he was prime minister, or do you see him adjusting some of those approaches if he comes back to power, if he's reelected?
Well, look, I mean, if you think back to the early days of the Imran Khan government, I mean, he got on very well with President Trump. He did come to Washington D.C. and engaged with the think tank community, had meetings with very senior officials within the government. Of course, there have been stresses all along in the American exit from Afghanistan and the outfall of that, right? And Pakistan initially, like the sort of the prominence of the Quetta Shura, the Haqqani network in the Taliban regime. I mean, they have been factors, stressful factors from the American side, right? And as well, there has been, and we can, there's a long history over the past 20 years. All the collateral damage that Pakistan experienced. So there was this anti-American sentiment. I mean, but there was domestically, there was also a falling out between the military establishment and Imran Khan, right? So he kind of tapped into this idea of anti-American sentiment. But now, because of his sort of, the immense support that he's enjoying within the country, he has, I think he's already, you see, him trying to walk back from that very fiery rhetoric, anti-American rhetoric. I mean, his political party has been in conversation with lobbyists in DC to try and sort of mend the relationship. The military establishment sort of has already distanced itself from Imran Khan's sort of more acrimonious posture, and there's a new army chief. So it's important to realize that when it comes to the Pakistani relationship with China, both democratic governments and the military government, I mean, going back to the Musharraf years when he invited the Chinese to come in and build that deep sea port in Gwadar, and then it was actually the Nawaz Sharif government which really, turned CPEC into the flagship project for the BRI, right? Even under Imran Khan, you had the chair of the CPEC authority was a retired general, right? So what was a military man. So there is a lot of, I mean, on the one hand, there's this consistency when it comes to engaging with China, and the Pakistani establishment also has a long-standing relationship with the US, which is probably going to remain. But it's also important to realize that Pakistan also has a bit of agency when it comes to China. I think from the American perspective, it might seem like it's being entrapped, but it's important to realize that Pakistan invited China to invest in the Gwadar seaport. It has not become a military port yet. Also, creating CPEC was also Pakistan's idea. And Pakistan does exercise agency. I mean, it's been inviting American firms, right? I mean, very senior people in very senior positions within CPEC have been, talking about the need for diverse international investment within the special economic zones created by China, right? And there hasn't been real evidence of Chinese disdain, because I mean, China also wants its loans to be returned. So I think that, there, despite, right now there is economic and political, tough times for Pakistan. Elections are going to take place. It'll probably be an uncertain environment for the next year or so. But I think we have to take a longer view when it comes to, thinking of these bilateral relations. And there's a long-standing history to these relations where, one individual coming in can not really act as a spoiler, and when he does actually, if he does come back into power and the kind of compromises that he'll have to make, well, I don't personally see him taking a entirely sort of adversarial position against the US. Imran Khan.
So one of our audience members, Mr. Albert Lee, so I'm going to read this from the chat. So forgive me if this comes across as less than diplomatic, but Pakistani state media started showing off recently acquired the Baykar combat drones, or is it Bayraktar? I don't know if that's what it's supposed to be, drones towards the tail end of the floods. So what reasons are there to trust that financial aid provided from the United States, provided in the face of the climate crisis, isn't just going to be dumped into rearming or arming the Pakistani army? So what confidence building measures can be made to ensure that this situation does not happen? And then he has a second question. So additionally, with recent reporting that the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, TTP, is abandoning its truce with Islamabad, which in fact has already happened, of course, it's restarted attacks across the tribal region, the tribal Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and the other tribal areas. Can the safety of U.S. investment or development efforts in TTP strongholds or near TTP strongholds, or even in cities, for example, such as Karachi, be guaranteed?
Great questions. Let me take the second one first, and then I'll turn to the first question. So yes, it is, and it's been the outfall of, and it was predicted by many, that there will be an outfall of the Taliban regime coming into power, because the Taliban regime is also caught between a rock and a hard place, where now the real ISK is trying to position itself as the real true insurgent force, right? And thinking of the Taliban as being complicit. And fearing attrition, the Taliban also have a very constrained space for diplomacy, and they've been sort of falling back on more hardline positions. And similarly, they are, they have a tough time sort of, taking action against their ideological twin, if you are, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan. So, that does create stress for Pakistan. Twice they've tried to mediate a ceasefire, but it's a tall order when the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan wants to, implement its agenda is like the Taliban to implement, their version, myopic version of Sharia across Pakistan. The Pakistani state is not going to play ball on that. So, it seemed like, attempts to have this kind of negotiation with them were going to be futile. But one always, there's need to give negotiation a chance. So now with the breakdown of the latest round, and the announcement that they are going to sort of, pick up arms again, it is creating, insecurity in the country. But, in the last year or two, there has increasingly been, and perhaps even slightly longer, there has been, even the BLA, the Balochistan Liberation Army resistance movement, alongside the Taliban, have been attacking, Chinese investments. And China has several times expressed concerns, and the attacks have been more ambitious. There have been attacks on the Karachi Stock Exchange, etc. And Pakistan is, trying to bolster, and it's taken steps recently in the last year or so to provide, more foolproof security. And it's easier to do so when it comes to protecting CPEC infrastructure. And that's why I was talking particularly about those special economic zones. Because if there is interest, in investing in those areas, those are more contained spaces, for American investment. But at the end of the day, it's up to the investor to assess the risk, because with risk, there's also enticement of making profit. And now I'll sort of turn to the earlier question. And I think, and here putting on my hat of a development anthropologist, I think that, there is also need for reflexivity, when it comes to things like elite capture and things like corruption, right? Where top-down policies, international development policies have also, enabled, the countries, many sort of, influential power brokers in developing countries to practice this, like, trickle-down model. So while it's not outright corruption, there has been a persistent problem of those economic growth models, this belief in market fundamentals to address problems like inequity and inequality, structural inequalities in these countries. So, when I talk about private investment, I want to say with a pinch of salt, because otherwise Pepsi and Coca-Cola and General Electric, I mean, they are already in Pakistan and doing rip-roaring business, right? But when it comes to, thinking of like business and human rights, right? So, I mean, that's why I wanted to tie this discussion to human-centric issues in particular, right? And there is, I think there's going to be, I mean, there are challenges, right? And there are mechanisms in place for, development aid in particular, in terms of accountability and reporting to, to try and avert sort of, elite capture, not only outright corruption. The problem of military aid, though, of aid falling into military hands, I mean, that's been a long-standing source of tension between the US and Pakistan, going all the way back to, training the holy warriors, the Mujahideen, against the Soviets, because, there was a suspicion that, armament and military support given to Pakistan for that purpose might also be being deflected towards India, towards enabling Pakistan to have a more assertive posture vis-a-vis India. Similarly, there's that fear in Pakistan now that as America builds India's capabilities, provides it access to satellite data, etc., which is meant to be China-centric, but it is raising insecurities within Pakistan as well. So it is hard, while there are efforts to try and contain, to try and direct that kind of support, that it is difficult to ensure. And I mean, let's also remember, I mean, the US government has also played ball with two of the largest military regimes in Pakistan, right? Like the Zia government, 10 years, the Musharraf government, 10 years, right? And it was at a geostrategic time where, Pakistan, for good or bad, was collaborating with the US in Afghanistan, and there's still within the US, I mean, there is always an eye out for how the military establishment is thinking, right? And there was a bit of a sigh of relief when the military establishment signaled that it was parting way with Imran Khan's latest posture with the US. So I think that, when it comes to sort of dealing with the civilian government, and there have been attempts in the past, right? The Kerry-Lugar bill was trying to do that, right? Was trying to not only have military cooperation, but have civilian cooperation at par, with military cooperation. But, that did not quite happen. So I think there's certainly, I mean, Pakistan has a legacy of military rule, and it still has a very strong, military presence in the political economy. I'm not denying that, but I think that, there's also need for reflexivity here.
Question from Lieutenant Colonel Baskin. So thank you for the presentation, sir. Without significant support via government subsidies, how can U.S. private enterprise compete with Chinese investment and development projects in Pakistan? Even within special economic zones, isn't it routine for Chinese companies to enter markets at artificially low thresholds to which US and other companies are just unable to compete with?
Yeah, that is, I mean, that is an issue that, I brought this to the fore because I'd been participating in, over the past few years in sort of, bilateral US-Pakistan dialogues on sort of, on the US-Pakistan bilateral relationship. And I saw, people who are from the business background, right, like talking about numerous opportunities, right? So there is, I mean, there are a lot of multinational corporations, American multinational corporations, which are already working in Pakistan. In fact, the head of the CPEC authority, former head, pointed out to me last year, I was interviewing him for some research, and he pointed out that, look, even within the energy projects, CPEC funded energy projects, Pakistan insisted and wanted GE generators, and we got them, right? So there was already de facto like kind of, a blending by Pakistan of American and Chinese technologies, if you will. And, there are some cutting edge areas where Pakistan, where American, and it need not only be conventional like multinational corporations. I mean, here one's also thinking of, more sort of development oriented activities like social entrepreneurship, right? So is there room to piggyback on existing sort of as Pakistan tries to build manufacturing capabilities, is there room for social entrepreneurship within those special economic zones? And these are ideas that the US is kind of, the American development sector, USAID, right, are at the forefront of, this idea of a double bottom line. Right, where there's public good, social good, and also meeting the business bottom line. So I mean, there'd have to be scoping exercises, and the experts will need to speak more to the specifics. But but some of these ideas have been resonating from earlier conversations that one has been privy to.
Thank you. A closing question, Muhammad Ali, about if you could talk a little bit more about the situation in Baluchistan, Pakistani Baluchistan, in terms of, you mentioned the BLA, you mentioned some other security issues, and also a slowdown in certain projects related to the port. If you could speak a little bit more about that.
I think Balochistan, remains a source of contention, and it's, I mean, the ironies of history that, Pakistan has already had an experience, right? Like, I mean, East and West Pakistan, if you remember, I mean, I very briefly alluded to it in the presentation as well, but back in 1971, right there, just because of the unfeasibility of Pakistan, East and West Pakistan, which was separated by 1,000 miles of India in the middle, right? So that in itself, and a hostile India at that. So that in itself was a problem, but there is no doubt that Western Pakistan, which is Pakistan today, was quite hegemonic, was unfair, in terms of economic and political accommodation to the East Wing, right? And then the Mukti Bhani was supported by India, and it ultimately broke off. So rather than using that as a lesson learned, right, and being more accommodating to other parts of Pakistan, there has been this tendency of doubling down on sort of, of the security imperative, right? And I mean, that has remained a lingering challenge for Pakistan. And there was hope that, CPEC would bring in much needed investment. But if one looks at, and some of this has to do with sort of the technical nature of, of what's been done so far. But but still there was room for greater local participation, within those CPEC projects. And there has been agitation. I mean, not only by the insurgents, but by ordinary Baloch, who participate in political processes. I mean, are upset by the sort of, by the by missing people, and sort of, they are suffering from the insecurity within Balochistan. But there's been protests, of sort of the benefits of CPEC not percolating down to the grassroots level sufficiently. But I mean, but that is the problem of elite capture is a persistent problem, right? I mean, and that's one of the major challenges of development in general, right? And it's a problem that even the World Bank and the IMF struggle with. I mean, China is a much newer player on the block in terms of international development, but elite capture and the inability of sort of these economic benefits to trickle down to the masses remains a problem. And of course, then they are compounded by sort of the insecurities. I mean, there's finger pointing. I mean, India points a finger at Pakistan for what happens in Kashmir, and Pakistan does the same in terms of what's happening in Balochistan. But there's no doubt that there is certainly need for greater economic and political accommodation within Balochistan.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to members of the audience. Thank you, Dr. Ali, once again for joining joining us today and sharing your expertise. Thank you. We appreciate it.
My pleasure, Chris. Thank you.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.